My name is Loretta Beaumont. I am 52 years old. I want to start with the night itself, because the night is where everything that had been building for 23 years finally arrived at the surface, and because I believe you need to be in that room before you can understand what the 23 years actually meant. It was a Thursday evening in November, 3 years ago, at the Georgia State Capitol Rotunda in Atlanta, where the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget holds its annual Public Service Excellence Awards ceremony, a formal gathering that brings together approximately 400 people, elected officials and agency heads and their families, and the specific assembled dignity of a state government occasion, everyone in their best clothes under the specific warm light of the rotunda's chandeliers, the dome above them painted in the particular gold that Georgia reserves for its official spaces. I was seated in the second row with my husband James and our 2 children, Marcus, who was 21, and Denise, who was 18, the specific family configuration of people who have been told something significant is happening and have dressed accordingly and are sitting with the particular alert attention of people waiting for a specific moment in a program. My mother-in-law, Vivian Beaumont, was seated in the front row. She had been given the front row seat at my specific request because she was 74 years old, and I understood that the front row would be easier for her to see from and easier for her to get to and from during the event, and because I had extended the invitation to her personally in a phone call 3 weeks before the ceremony, because she was James's mother, and James loved her, and she was, regardless of everything that had existed between us across 23 years of marriage, a woman I believed deserved to be present for something her son was proud of. She had accepted the invitation. She had arrived in a burgundy dress she had bought specifically for the occasion, which James told me about when he picked her up from the hotel, and she had sat in the front row with the specific composed attention of a woman who understood she was at something formal and was conducting herself accordingly. The program ran for approximately 90 minutes. There were 5 award categories. I was in the 4th category, Distinguished Career in Public Administration, which the program described as recognizing individuals who have demonstrated sustained, exceptional contribution to the efficient and equitable delivery of public services across a career of 20 or more years. 20 or more years. I had been in public administration for 27 years at the time of the ceremony. 27 years of a career that had begun as an entry-level budget analyst at the Georgia Department of Human Services at the age of 25, and that had progressed through the specific combination of competence and endurance and the particular kind of institutional loyalty that actually changes institutions rather than simply serving them, to the position I held at the time of the ceremony, which was Deputy Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, the second highest administrative position in an agency with a $400 million annual budget, and a mandate that covered housing policy, community development, and rural economic development across the entire state. When the governor stood at the podium and read my name, I stood. My husband reached for my hand as I stood. Marcus made a sound beside him that I heard as something between a laugh and a thing harder to name. Denise pressed her hands together in front of her face, which is the specific gesture she makes when she is trying not to cry in public. I walked to the podium. The governor shook my hand. I received the award, a specific crystal piece with the Georgia seal and my name and the year engraved on it, and I said the words I had prepared, which were brief and specific and genuine, thanking the people who had actually made the work possible across 27 years, my staff and my mentors and the communities across Georgia whose needs had been the actual substance of everything I had built. I did not look at Vivian Beaumont while I was at the podium. I looked at James. I looked at Marcus and Denise. I looked at the governor and at the room and at the specific assembled weight of 400 people who were there, because this work mattered and because they understood, in their various capacities and contexts, why it mattered. When I returned to my seat, James held my hand for the remainder of the program. He did not say anything. He did not need to. After the ceremony, in the reception that followed, I walked to the front row where Vivian was still seated, Waiting, I understood, for the room to clear enough that movement would be manageable. I offered her my arm. She took it. We walked to where James and the children were standing, near the reception table, in the specific warm light of the rotunda that was, at that hour, more beautiful than it had been during the formal program. She held my arm for longer than the walk required. When we reached James and the children, she let go of my arm, and she looked at me, and she said, in a voice that was quieter than her usual voice, and that had a quality I had not heard from her before in 23 years, something that I want to describe precisely because precision serves this moment better than any larger framing. She said, "Loretta, I owe you something I have been a long time getting around to." I looked at her. She said, "I have been wrong about you, for a very long time. I want you to know I understand that now." I said, "I know, Vivian." She said, "I don't know if knowing it is enough." I said, "It's a beginning." We stood there, in the Georgia State Capitol Rotunda, 3 of us and the Crystal Award, and 23 years between us, in the specific warm light that was becoming the only light as the chandeliers did what chandeliers do in that particular room in November, which is to make everything beneath them look, briefly, like it has already become history. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Macon, Georgia, the second of 4 children born to Leonard and Constance Jeffries, who had met in 1963 at a church social in the specific way that people met in that particular world at that particular moment, in the organized social spaces of Black community life in the American South, in the years when those spaces were, by necessity and by choice, completely self-sufficient. My father worked at a printing company for 31 years, starting on the floor and working up to a supervisory position that he held for the last 14 years of his career. My mother taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house for 26 years, the specific 2-block proximity meaning that my siblings and I walked past her classroom every day for the entirety of our childhood and had a relationship to her professional life that was more daily and more specific than most children's relationship to their parents' work. My parents were, in the specific way of their generation and their community and their faith tradition, people who understood that dignity was not given but maintained, that maintaining it required continuous specific effort, and that the effort was not a burden but a practice. The particular practice of people who understood that the world they were living in required a specific kind of sustained, excellent conduct from them that it did not require from everyone, and who had made peace with that requirement rather than being broken by it. I absorbed this from them in the specific way you absorb things that are the permanent atmosphere of your childhood, rather than the occasional lesson. It was not taught to me in any explicit conversation. It was demonstrated daily across the 18 years I spent in that house, in the way my father conducted himself at the printing company, and the way my mother conducted herself in her classroom, and the way both of them conducted themselves in the world when the world was being difficult, which it sometimes was, in the specific ways that the American South of the 1970s and 80s was sometimes difficult for Black families who were doing exactly what they were supposed to do and being treated in various specific contexts as though this were insufficient. I was an excellent student, not because I was performing excellence for an audience, but because I had been raised inside an understanding of what education actually was, which was not a credential but a specific form of freedom, the freedom of knowing things and being able to think about what you knew. And I wanted that freedom the way you want things you have been taught to understand as genuinely valuable. I went to Georgia State University on a merit scholarship. I studied public administration, a choice that surprised some people, and did not surprise my mother, who said when I told her, "You have always wanted to fix things that are broken for the people who need them fixed most. That's what public administration is." She was right. That is what public administration is, when it is done well, and I had understood from early in my undergraduate education that doing it well was both more possible and more difficult than most people who had opinions about government work believed, and that the specific combination of those 2 things, more possible than cynics thought, and more difficult than idealists thought, was the combination I was most suited for. I graduated at 23. I took the entry-level position at the Georgia Department of Human Services at 25, after 2 years at a nonprofit that gave me the specific ground-level view of what the people public administration was supposed to serve actually needed, as distinct from what bureaucratic systems were designed to deliver, a gap that turned out to be the central professional question of my career, and that I spent 27 years working on from the inside. I met James Beaumont at a professional development workshop in Atlanta in 1997. He was 29, working for a regional bank in their community development lending division, a role that put him in regular contact with the same nonprofits and government agencies that I was working with from the public administration side. He was, from the first conversation, someone I recognized as genuinely serious about the work in the way that I was serious about it. Not as a career ladder, but as the actual substance of something that mattered. We dated for 18 months before he proposed. We were engaged for 8 months before we married. We have been married now for 23 years, and I want to say, plainly and without the specific performance of marital contentment that some stories require, that our marriage has been the central fact of my adult life, in the way that only the things you choose most completely become central facts, chosen freely, maintained deliberately, and worth every specific difficulty it has produced, of which there have been some, as there are in every honest marriage. James's family was from Augusta. His father, Raymond Beaumont, had died when James was 19, a sudden illness, and the family had reorganized itself around Vivian in the specific way of families that lose their center and find a new one in whoever has the strength to hold the shape. Vivian held the shape. She had held it for 10 years by the time I met her, and the holding had produced in her the particular quality of someone whose strength and her identity had become so completely fused that she sometimes could not distinguish between her own authority and the family's well-being, between what she genuinely believed was right and what she genuinely needed to be true. She had a daughter, James's older sister Carol, who had married and moved to Charlotte and who maintained a warm and regular relationship with her mother from a comfortable distance. She had James, who was her specific pride and joy in the particular intense way of mothers whose sons have grown up carrying the weight of an absent father, and who have become, in the process, the kind of men that the weight produces when it is carried with integrity. She had, before I arrived, a very clear vision of who James would eventually marry. Not a specific person, a specific category. A woman from Augusta or somewhere near enough to count, from a family Vivian knew or knew of, with roots in the specific social world of middle-class Black Augusta that Vivian had navigated for 30 years and that she understood as the map of what was appropriate and what was not. I was from Macon. My family was not known to Vivian. I worked for the state government, which was, in Vivian's framework, a respectable enough position, but not the specific kind of position she had imagined for her son's wife, which was something more visibly private sector, something with the specific markers of ambition that she associated with the kind of professional success she had wanted for James, and therefore by extension for whoever James chose. I understood this from our first meeting. Not from anything Vivian said directly, because Vivian was not a direct person in the sense of saying exactly what she thought to people she had just met. She was direct in a different way, the way of someone who communicates primarily through the specific quality of their attention and the particular texture of their warmth, and whose attention and warmth, when they are being managed rather than freely given, communicate exactly what is being withheld and why. She was polite to me from the beginning. I want to be accurate about this. She was never rude to me in any way that could be cleanly identified and pointed to. She was polite with a specific quality of reservation that I recognized and did not misread. The politeness of someone who is managing their response to someone they have not decided about, or who has decided and is managing the expression of having decided. James told me, in the second year of our marriage, about a conversation he had had with his mother before our wedding. He told me because it came up in a conversation we were having about his mother's relationship to me, and why it had the specific texture it had, and because James is a man who believes, fundamentally, that the relationships in his life should be built on accurate information rather than managed impressions, and because he had been carrying the knowledge of that conversation for 2 years and had decided that carrying it alone was not consistent with the marriage he was trying to build. He said, "Before the wedding, Mom told me she had concerns." I said, "What kind of concerns?" He said, "She said she thought I could do better. She said she worried that you were—" He stopped. I waited. He said, "She said she worried you would never amount to much, that a government job was a place people went when they weren't capable of building something real, that she didn't think you had the specific ambition she wanted for me, for us." I looked at my husband across the kitchen table of our apartment in Atlanta in the second year of our marriage, and I held what he had just told me in the specific way I hold things that are significant, without immediate reaction, because I have learned that my most accurate responses to significant things arrive after the first wave of feeling has passed, rather than during it. I said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her she was wrong. I told her that what she was reading as a lack of ambition was something different, that you had a specific kind of ambition that was organized around something she didn't have a framework for understanding. I told her that I knew who you were and that I was going to marry you." I said, "And?" He said, "She said she hoped I knew what I was doing." I looked at my husband. I said, "She was entitled to her opinion." He said, "I know. I also know that her opinion was wrong, and I should have told you sooner rather than carrying it alone." I said, "Why are you telling me now?" He said, "Because the way she treats you has a texture that I think you've noticed and haven't said anything about, and I think you deserve to know the source of the texture rather than having to infer it." This was, I want to be honest, one of the most significant moments of my marriage. Not because the information itself was surprising, but because of what James's choice to share it represented. He had chosen accuracy over comfort. He had chosen to give me the full picture of what I was navigating, rather than managing the picture in ways that would have been more comfortable for everyone in the short term and more costly in the long term. He had trusted me with information that reflected poorly on his mother and that required him to acknowledge his own discomfort about what she had said. I filed the information. In the specific internal way I file things that matter, not as a wound, but as a fact. Vivian believed I would never amount to much. She had said this to my husband before our wedding. She had continued across the following years to treat me with the specific texture of someone who has made a determination and is simply waiting for the determination to be confirmed. I did not change my behavior toward Vivian because of what James told me. I continued to be the specific person I had always been in her presence, respectful and genuine and consistent, not because I was performing for her benefit, but because those qualities were not things I deployed strategically and withdrew when the audience was unreceptive. They were simply who I was. I also did not change what I was doing professionally. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters enormously to what eventually happened. I was not working toward anything specific designed to disprove Vivian's assessment. I was working because the work was important and because I was good at it, and because 27 years of public administration in Georgia had given me a specific, deep, irreplaceable understanding of what the state's communities needed and what the system serving those communities actually did and failed to do. I was working because I had been raised by Leonard and Constance Jeffries to understand that work done with genuine commitment and genuine care was its own justification, not a means to an external validation, but a form of life. I want to tell you about the work itself, because I think the work is the center of this story, and it deserves to be described with the care it actually requires, rather than summarized as career backdrop. I spent my first 8 years at the Georgia Department of Human Services doing the specific foundational work of someone learning an institution from the inside, understanding not only the policy frameworks and the budgetary structures, but the particular human texture of how those structures actually operated at the level where they touched people's lives. I worked with caseworkers and with clients. I attended community meetings in neighborhoods that the agency served. I read files not to audit them, but to understand the specific people inside them as more than administrative cases. I became, across those 8 years, someone who understood the gap between what the systems were designed to deliver and what the people who depended on those systems actually needed. And I developed specific, detailed, practical ideas about how to close that gap in ways that were financially sustainable and institutionally achievable within the specific constraints of public administration in Georgia. I moved to the Department of Community Affairs at 33, specifically because I had identified it as the agency whose mandate most directly addressed the gap I had spent 8 years understanding. Community affairs in Georgia covered housing policy, community development grants, rural economic development, and the specific infrastructure of community well-being that the human services system depended on, but could not itself build. I joined it as a program director and spent 3 years rebuilding a grant distribution system that had been, by any honest assessment, allocating public resources in ways that did not reflect either community need or programmatic effectiveness. The rebuilding was not popular with everyone. That is a specific understatement. The previous allocation system had benefited certain communities and certain political relationships over others, not through explicit corruption, but through the specific accumulated inertia of a system that had never been required to examine whether its distributions were achieving their stated goals. Examining this, which I did with the specific methodical care that characterized my approach to every institutional problem I encountered, produced findings that required changes, and changes in how public resources are allocated always cost someone something, and the people who were costed something were not always pleased about it. I navigated those years through the specific combination of careful documentation, stakeholder engagement, and the particular form of political patience that public administration requires of people who intend to change things that have been resistant to change, which is the patience of someone who understands that institutional change moves at the speed of institutional trust, and that institutional trust is built through the consistent demonstration of what you will and will not do over time, rather than through any single act of persuasion. I was promoted to deputy director at 39, to associate commissioner at 44, to deputy commissioner at 48, the position I held at the time of the ceremony, with a staff of 312 people and a budget of $400 million, and the specific daily weight of knowing that the decisions I made affected the housing security and economic stability of communities across Georgia in ways that were sometimes invisible to everyone except the people directly affected by them. This was the work. 27 years of it. Not glamorous in the specific way that the word glamorous is usually deployed, not visible in the particular form of visibility that the world most easily recognizes, but real in the most fundamental sense of the word, producing specific measurable changes in the conditions of people's lives through the sustained, patient, rigorous application of institutional knowledge in service of something larger than any individual career. Vivian Beaumont believed I would never amount to much. I had spent 27 years amounting to exactly what I was. I want to describe the years of my marriage and my relationship with Vivian during the period before the ceremony, because I think the texture of those years matters to understanding what the ceremony actually meant. Vivian was present in our lives in the specific way of a nearby mother-in-law who maintained regular contact without being intrusive, which in practice meant Sunday phone calls with James, holiday gatherings at our house or hers, the occasional weekday visit when she was in Atlanta for a medical appointment or other business. She was warm with Marcus and Denise in the specific, uncomplicated way of grandparents, whose relationship to grandchildren is not burdened by the complications of the adult relationships around them. And watching her with my children across the years produced the specific, complicated feeling of someone observing genuine love in a relationship that exists in the same space as a more ambivalent one. She was never unkind to me in any way I could point to directly. This is the honest description of 23 years, and I want to be accurate about it rather than revising it to serve the story. She was reserved. She was polite in a way that communicated its own management. She occasionally asked about my work in the specific way of someone executing a social courtesy rather than expressing genuine curiosity, asking the question and receiving the answer without the follow-up questions that genuine curiosity produces. I did not perform warmth I did not feel toward Vivian. I want to be honest about this also. I was respectful, and I was consistent, and I was present in all the ways that presence was required, holiday gatherings and family occasions, and the specific daily courtesies of a daughter-in-law relationship. But I did not pretend to a closeness that did not exist, because pretending would have been a form of dishonesty that I believed was worse for everyone involved than the honest distance we maintained. James knew the texture of the relationship and had accepted it with the specific resigned sadness of a man who loves both his wife and his mother, and has concluded, through the specific experience of 23 years of living in the middle of their dynamic, that the most he could do was be honest with both of them and hope that time would do what he could not do directly. Time had not done what he hoped, not in any dramatic way, across the first 22 years. What changed it was the ceremony. And the ceremony only changed it because of what the ceremony represented, which was the specific, formal, publicly witnessed acknowledgement of 27 years of work that Vivian had, in her original assessment, determined would never produce anything worth acknowledging. I want to tell you about how the nomination came about, because I think understanding it corrects a specific misapprehension about how public service recognition usually works. I did not apply for the award. I want to be direct about this because I think it matters. The governor's office solicits nominations from state agencies and from a selection of community organizations that interact with state government across multiple program areas, and the nominations are reviewed by an independent committee that evaluates candidates against specific criteria before making recommendations to the governor's office. My nomination was submitted by 3 separate sources: the current Commissioner of Community Affairs, who had worked with me for 6 years, and who submitted a nomination letter that James told me, when he saw it, was the most specific and thorough professional assessment he had read in his career in community development. The second was the Georgia Association of Community Action Agencies, a statewide organization representing the nonprofits that implemented many of the programs our department funded, whose nomination described specific programmatic changes I had led and their measurable effects on the communities they served. The third was a letter from a community organization in rural Coffee County, one of the most economically distressed counties in the state, whose director had worked with me across a 5-year rural economic development initiative, and who wrote in her nomination letter that what I had done for Coffee County was the difference between a community that was declining and a community that had the specific tools to determine its own future. I did not know about any of these nominations until my commissioner called me into his office in September to inform me that I had been selected and to ask whether I would be willing to accept the award at the ceremony in November. I said yes. I told James that evening. He cried briefly, the specific brief tears of a man who has watched his wife work for 27 years and who understands, with the full comprehension of someone who has been present throughout, exactly what the work has been. Then I called my mother in Macon. Then I called my commissioner back and asked whether I could request a specific number of front row seats for the ceremony, because I wanted James's mother to be in the front row, and I wanted to make that request formally rather than through any informal channel. He said he would arrange it. I called Vivian myself, 3 weeks before the ceremony, the specific phone call I had been thinking about since the moment I decided I wanted her there. She answered on the 3rd ring, and I told her what was happening and that I wanted her to be present, and that I had arranged a front row seat specifically for her. She was quiet for a moment after I told her. Then she said, "Why would you want me there, Loretta?" I said, "Because you are James's mother, and because James is proud of me, And because I think you should see what 23 years of the thing you didn't believe in actually looks like when it arrives at a specific destination. There was a longer silence. She said, "That's a very honest reason." I said, "I have found, across 27 years of public administration, that honesty is more useful than tact when something important needs to be said." She said, "I'll be there." Let me pause here for a moment because I want to say something directly before I continue. I have told you about the ceremony, and I have told you about the 23 years, and I want to tell you something about what both of those things actually mean, because I think the meaning is more important than the narrative shape, and I do not want the narrative shape to obscure it. I did not work for 27 years in order to prove Vivian Beaumont wrong. I want to be absolutely clear about this because I think it is the most important thing I can tell you. The work was never about her. The work was about what my parents had raised me to understand was worth doing, which was the specific, patient, demanding work of making public institutions more effective in service of the people who needed them most. That work would have been exactly what it was, regardless of whether Vivian believed I would amount to something or not, because what I amounted to was never determined by what Vivian or anyone else believed about me. What I want you to understand is the specific thing the ceremony produced that was different from the work itself, which was a specific public witness to what the work had been, a formal acknowledgement in a formal room with 400 people present, and the governor's hand in mine that the 27 years had produced something that could be seen and named and handed to me in the form of a crystal award with my name engraved on it. And I want you to understand why I wanted Vivian in the front row, not to humiliate her, not to perform a vindication. I wanted her there because she was 74 years old, and she had been wrong about something for 23 years, and I believed, in the specific way I believed things I had come to understand through long observation of human behavior in institutional contexts, that people who have been wrong for a long time are sometimes capable of the specific correction that arrives when the evidence becomes impossible to accommodate within the existing framework, and that the ceremony was the specific moment when the evidence and the framework were going to occupy the same room. I wanted her to be there because I believed it was time for the framework to change, and because I believed that Vivian Beaumont, at 74, was still capable of that change, and because I believed that extending her the invitation was the specific act of generosity that the situation required, not for her sake primarily, but because James deserved to have his mother and his wife in the same room understanding each other clearly, finally, before too much more time passed. I had waited 23 years. I was not going to wait longer than was necessary. I want to tell you about the conversation in the car on the way back from the ceremony because I think it is where the story's most important human moment occurred, more important even than the corridor at the reception. Vivian rode with us, in James's car, Marcus and Denise in the back with her, and James and me in the front, the specific family configuration of people returning from something significant that was still very much present in the car with them. The drive from the Capitol to the hotel where Vivian was staying was 22 minutes. I know the specific time because I had driven it the previous week to understand the logistics of the evening. For the first several minutes, nobody said anything of substance. Marcus and Denise were talking to each other in the quiet way of siblings processing something they had both witnessed and had not yet found the language for. James was driving with both hands on the wheel in the specific posture he adopts when he is holding something significant internally. Vivian said, from the back seat, "Loretta." I turned to look at her. She said, "How long did you know about the award before the ceremony?" I said, "About 2 months." She said, "And you invited me 3 weeks before?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Why not immediately?" I said, "Because I needed to decide whether to invite you at all, and the deciding took some time." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What did you decide?" I said, "I decided that what I had built deserved to be witnessed by the people who had most doubted it, not as a demonstration, as an invitation to revise something that needed revising. James's hands tightened slightly on the wheel, not from tension, from something else that I recognized as the specific physical expression of a man hearing his wife say something that required the adjustment of his hands on whatever he was holding. Vivian said, "You knew what I said." "Before the wedding?" I said, "James told me in our second year of marriage. He thought I deserved the full information about what I was navigating." She said, "He never told me he told you." I said, "I know. He told me because he believed our marriage should be built on accurate information. He wasn't telling me to create a conflict. He was telling me because concealing it was costing something he didn't want to spend." She was quiet for a longer time. She said, "I was protecting him." That was what I told myself. I was his mother, and I had raised him alone for 10 years, and I had a specific idea of what his life was supposed to look like, and you didn't fit the idea. I said, "I know." She said, "But that's not really what I was doing, is it?" I said, "I think you were scared of losing him." I think the specific form that fear took was a judgment about me that made the fear feel more justified than the fear alone would have been. But I think underneath the judgment, the thing driving it was that he was your son, and he was choosing his life, and you had a very strong feeling about what his life should look like, and it wasn't what he chose. Vivian was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that I want to record precisely because I have thought about it many times since. She said, "My mother told me once that the hardest thing about loving someone is letting them be themselves, rather than the version of them that makes you feel safe." I believed her when she said it. I forgot to apply it. The car was quiet for a moment. I said, "It's not too late to apply it, Vivian." She said, "I know. I've been thinking about that since I sat down in that front row and watched you walk to that podium." I said, "What were you thinking?" She said, "I was thinking that the woman up there was exactly what she had always been, and that I had spent 23 years not seeing it because I was looking for the thing I wanted rather than the thing that was there." James made a sound in the front seat. I looked at him. His eyes were wet in the specific way of a man who does not cry easily and has just discovered that the thing he most needed to happen in his family is happening in a car on a 22-minute drive from the Georgia state capitol to a hotel in Midtown Atlanta. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. He covered my hand with his. We drove the rest of the way in the specific quiet of 4 people who have been through something significant and are still inside it and do not need to fill the quiet with anything other than the quiet. I want to tell you about what happened between Vivian and me in the 3 years since the ceremony, because I believe the aftermath is more important to this story than the ceremony itself, and because the aftermath required something from both of us that was more difficult and more genuine than a single moment of acknowledgement. We had dinner, Vivian and I, 6 weeks after the ceremony, at a restaurant in Augusta, the city she had lived in for 50 years, chosen by her, and in that choice itself communicating something, that she was inviting me into the specific space of her life, rather than waiting for me to invite her into mine. We talked for 3 hours, not about the ceremony, about the 23 years, about James, about Marcus and Denise, and what kind of grandmother she had been to them, and whether she had been the kind of grandmother she wanted to be. About her own life, the specific texture of it that I had never been given full access to because the reserved distance between us had cut both ways, preventing her from knowing me fully but also preventing me from knowing her fully. She told me about Raymond's death, about the 10 years of raising James and Carol alone in Augusta, about the specific fear, the one she had named in the car, of losing James to a life she could not fully see or access, a fear that had been building since he left for college at 18, and that had never, in the 23 years of our marriage, been fully addressed by anything except the ceremony and the car ride and this dinner. I told her about my parents, about Leonard and Constance Jeffries and the printing company and the classroom 2 blocks from the house, about what I had absorbed from them about dignity and work and the specific practice of both, about why I had chosen public administration and what I had believed about it at 25 and what I still believed about it now and what 27 years inside it had revised and what it had confirmed. She listened. Not with the specific managed attention of someone executing a social courtesy, with the particular focused quality of someone who is genuinely receiving information and integrating it, updating something internal rather than confirming something already decided. At the end of the dinner, she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, even if the honest answer is difficult." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Do you think you can forgive me for what I said to James before your wedding? Not the 23 years of how I behaved as a result of it. Specifically the thing I said, that you would never amount to much." I sat with the question for a long moment. I said, "I want to be honest with you about what forgiveness means in this context, Vivian, because I think honesty serves both of us better than a quick answer." She said, "All right." I said, "What you said to James before our wedding was wrong. Not in the sense of morally wrong, though that too, but in the specific empirical sense of wrong. It was an inaccurate prediction about a person you did not know. And what it cost, across 23 years, was a relationship between us that could have been more than it was, for both of us and for James and for the children. That is the specific loss I am willing to name as a loss." I said, "Whether I can forgive that loss is something I am still working out. I am not there yet in the specific, complete way that forgiveness requires. What I am is genuinely willing to build something different going forward, based on who we actually are, rather than who you thought I was and who you thought I wasn't." She looked at me. She said, "Is that enough to start with?" I said, "I think it's what we actually have, and I would rather start with what we actually have than perform something more complete than it is." She nodded. She said, "You are, I understand now, an exceptionally precise person." I said, "I was raised by a woman who taught third grade for 26 years. Precision was not optional." She laughed. The real kind. The kind that arrives without permission and that I had not, across 23 years, heard from Vivian Beaumont in my specific presence. I want to record that laugh because I think it mattered as much as anything else in this story. Not because it resolved anything, because it was genuine, and therefore it was a beginning. Here is what 27 years of public administration and 23 years of a marriage with a complicated mother-in-law and one Thursday evening in November in the Georgia State Capitol Rotunda taught me. I know that the work you do when no one is watching in the way that matters to you, the work that is not seen or understood or valued by the specific people whose understanding you most want, is still the real work, and the real work is still what you are accountable for. And its worth does not diminish, because the specific people you would most want to understand it have organized themselves around a different assessment. I know that the people who dismiss you are almost always dismissing a category rather than a person, and that categories, unlike persons, do not change their behavior over time in ways that require a category's revision, which is why the category persists regardless of what you do, until the moment when the person inside the category does something so specifically themselves that it can no longer be accommodated within the category's boundaries. That is the moment the category breaks. Not through argument. Through the specific, irresistible reality of a person being entirely and undeniably themselves in a room that cannot look away. I know that the invitation I extended to Vivian was not for her sake alone. It was for mine, and for James's, and for the specific relationship between all of us that had been impoverished by 23 years of an unexamined framework, and that I deserved to have the framework examined in my presence rather than simply allowed to continue past its utility. I know that forgiveness in its complete form takes longer than a ceremony and a car ride and a 3-hour dinner. I know that what I am building with Vivian Beaumont at this specific stage is honest and real and imperfect, and more valuable than the managed distance it replaced. And that building it honestly is more important than arriving at it quickly. And I know that my mother, Constance Jeffries, who taught third grade for 26 years 2 blocks from our house in Macon, was right about exactly one thing in particular, which is the thing she told me when I was 17 and had asked her why she worked so hard at something that so often felt thankless. She said, "Loretta, the work is not for the thanks. The work is for the people who need the work. You do it right and you do it long enough, and eventually the room catches up to what you have been doing in it. Your job is to be there when the room catches up." I was there. The room caught up. That is my story. A front row seat in the Georgia State Capitol Rotunda. A 23-year-old assessment that was wrong in every specific particular. And a car ride, 22 minutes long, in which the assessment finally met the actual record of the actual person and was required at last to revise itself. If this reminded you of work you have been doing for a room that has not yet caught up to it, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that the room catches up eventually and that your job is to be there when it does. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.